Okay, we still got more to go this morning, so we're going to get right started with our next conversation. I've had a chance in this job to meet Samantha Power on a number of occasions, and early on, I think the first person I invited to come and speak at our conference this year was Ambassador Power, and she's coming off a recent trip, so she was able to join us here in Washington. So let me just open with one first question. Now, a lot of people don't know really what the ambassador to the UN does. And we've
watch House of Cards?
Well, we've seen House of Cards, and so Robin. Now I know that President Obama has Michelle, so you're not married to the president, but maybe you could help peek behind the curtain. So we've seen Robin Wright, but maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what it's really like, not just what it's like on House of Cards.
Okay. Well, to start, I'll state the obvious, which is that there are very few problems on planet Earth that can be solved by one country acting alone these days. So whether it's fighting ISIL or fighting climate change or fighting Ebola, we do a lot of fighting. It's really important that you harness the resources of lots of countries at once, because these threats cross borders, because no one country can bear the burden alone, et cetera. And so a ton of what the U.S. ambassador does, because U.S. leadership is critical to mobilizing those coalitions, is come forth with our commitment and then seek to leverage those commitments to get other countries to pile on. The other thing we do is we're forever looking to build our norms and extend our norms and institutional frameworks and legal frameworks so they're tailored toward 2016 and not toward 1945. And so some examples on that, who knew that terrorism in the 21st century would entail so much use of antiquities as a means of moving money around. The extent to which the foreign terrorist fighter problem has cropped up with people flowing from developed countries, from the United States, from lots of countries in Europe into Syria and Iraq, and then returning to their countries. What does that entail then for border security frameworks, and how should the international legal regime embrace that? So it's thinking through what does actually enforcing and promoting international peace and security, promoting human rights, promoting economic development entail in the here and now, and then trying to modernize the institution and the way the states that comprise the UN act in response. The other thing I'm very privileged as a member of President Obama's administration is to also be a member of the cabinet. And so one very valuable aspect, I think, of living in New York and being every day surrounded by 192 other countries is to be able to bring other countries' perspectives and the kind of reaction to the kinds of things that we're pushing into the so-called interagency debate here in Washington. So we're able to factor that in, and I advocate as a member of the Principals Committee, for different policies for the U.S. to pursue.
You mentioned fighting, and this morning you had a tweet about a Bangladesh force. So maybe you could just tell those who have not been on their Twitter, because they're so riveted by the proceedings here that they're even looking at their iPhone. They don't even have it turned on. So maybe you could just tell everybody about that.
Well, UN peacekeeping is an example of a kind of collective solution for the problem of mass atrocity, the problem of instability, conflict. And, of course, half of every society is women, but the UN peacekeepers, the militaries, the UN police who deploy tend to be very male-dominated, as they are within the member states that comprise the UN. And this is something that is a recurring theme, that the UN tends to be a symptom and reflect the dynamics that exist within member states. So we were very encouraged. Bangladesh has taken the lead not only in creating all-female police units, but also appointing a female commander for the first time. So what I tweeted was a picture of this all-male unit with this female commander that is about to deploy to a UN peacekeeping mission.
So, actually, you're the
and it got a lot of retweets. It was. I wasn't expecting my Bangladesh tweet to go viral.
It's a large Bangladesh contingent.
So, yeah, clearly. I've got a lot of Bangladeshi followers.
You're the fourth woman who's been our representative to the United Nations. And do any other countries have as strong a record? And also, how has that perhaps helped more women in more senior leadership roles in foreign policy?
Well, when you put it that way, I've never actually thought of myself as one of four, but they're an amazing four: Jeane Kirkpatrick, Madeleine Albright, Susan Rice, or amazing three at least. And I do my best.
Amazing four.
Would
we agree on amazing four?
Amazing
Yes.
three at least. But they're. I mean, I remember growing up and coming. I was an immigrant to this country, and Jeane Kirkpatrick made quite the impression, even on a young Irish immigrant. I mean, just as this force of nature standing up for American values, American interests, and Madeleine Albright, of course, famously during the Yugoslav crisis, the war in Bosnia, Kosovo, her strength, and of course, Ambassador Rice securing some of the toughest sanctions we've ever seen against Iran, which in turn helped give rise to this nuclear deal. So it's an amazing lineage. I don't know how other countries have done by comparison, but I can tell you that when I was nominated by President Obama to try to seek advice and consent from the U.S. Senate to be in the job, one of the first people I called was Madeleine Albright, and she said that what she had done when she got to New York, and at that time there were 183 countries in the UN, is she had created a group of women ambassadors and who met regularly and tried to think were there things that they could cooperate on, could they move the needle in different respects, whether on women's empowerment or protection of women in conflict or on things totally unrelated to women. And the group, sort of sad to say, was called the G7 because there were only 7 women ambassadors out of 183 in the entire UN, and that was 1993 when she started. We're now the G36. I've created the same network. We're now 193 countries in the UN. The percentage, interestingly, the 36 out of 193 is almost identical to the decimal point to the percentage of women in Congress, in the US Congress. So again, I think speaking to the way in which the UN is a reflection of how things are in member states. And unfortunately, there's never been a woman Secretary General. There have been 70 presidents of the UN General Assembly, and only 2 of them have been women in the entire 70-year career. And now, even though we 2 years ago had 6 women ambassadors out of 15 on the UN Security Council, which is the kind of premier body for promoting international peace and security, just because of the rotation of ambassadors in and out of New York, but also countries off the council and new countries on, we're now down to 1. So in 2016, we have 1 woman ambassador out of 15.
That would be you.
That happens to be me. And when I think about, young girls, those tours that come through the UN, and they look in 2016 and they see this horseshoe and raising our hands or not raising our hands, depending on how the day is going, and just to see 1 woman there, it's a complete anachronism. So I think it cuts in lots of different directions. Of course, in order to make progress on the substance, we need the men to be elevating women's empowerment and fighting sexual violence with all the same zeal as women ambassadors. So we need to do both, get more representation because it's right and normal, and we also need the issues not to be marginalized, and they can't depend on women ambassadors to be raising issues that are of central importance to everybody.
The U.S. and your role at the UN, partly, advocating for rule of law, partly also advocating a certain moral tone. 2 thoughts I have. One is, how do you thread that needle? And I know recently you took a number of ambassadors to a Broadway show, Fun Home. Maybe you could also talk about that a little bit.
Well, prior to taking the UN ambassadors to Fun Home, which is a musical that won the Tony, telling the story of Ally Bechtel, a lesbian woman. It's her kind of life's journey of coming out, and it's extremely powerful, funny, poignant, amazing musical. Prior to bringing 17 ambassadors to that, recognizing that LGBT rights are not universally hailed, to say the least. There's more than 75 countries that criminalize being gay. So that was a very important experience for us as ambassadors to see it, and it kind of took us away from, what's your country's position on LGBT rights to being moved by a human story and rendering the question of what we do at the UN for individuals who are being discriminated against or being persecuted or being, in some cases, arrested for their sexuality. It took it away from that, fight with one country on one side of the room and others on another side of the room to something much more human, where it was about how do you identify with this girl and couldn't it be your daughter or your friend? And it was really extremely powerful to see this cross-regional group. We had countries from Africa, Asia, Latin America, Eastern Europe. It was very, very powerful. And it meant a lot to the cast because they said, we feel every night that we're changing America a little bit, but we never thought we could change the world. And by getting this story and this way of generating empathy out into the sinews of the world, maybe we can make a dent over time. But prior to Fun Home, I took the Security Council to Hamilton. And I'm very proud of a number of...
This sounds like a good job.
Yeah, exactly. Don't get the wrong idea. It's mainly terrorism and aggression and conflict. But part of the reason to do that is also, there's a way in which countries that are developing, whether economically or in terms of their nascent or not yet extant democracies, there's a way in which they see the United States as the sum of where we are in 2016 with all of our struggles, very well advanced with strong institutions, with checks and balances, of course, with our economy. It's hard for them to identify with our creation and with our struggle and with the early years and how contested everything was and how uninevitable the journey that we've been on actually is. And so, again, like with Fun Home, to bring people back into the foundational story, I think on the back end of an experience like that, you're in a stronger position to deliver a tough message about what may be going on within another country's borders if you do so from the position of, we're not holier than thou about this. We've had our own struggles, and this is where we've come from. So,
what partly germane to this audience, what do you think is the role that global economics, trade, and investment can do in furthering human rights, human development, and so we can link those a little bit better?
Well, we have to link them a little bit better, and I'm struck wherever I travel that the concept that unites economic development, trade, foreign investment with freedom of speech, freedom of religion, democratization, the civil and political rights, the concept that unites them is dignity. And, it is extremely important for us as a government to be advocating on behalf of policies that are actually going to expand the availability of opportunity and jobs and are going to encourage economic development and growth in these countries. And at the same time, since policies and corruption and actions that would negate those gains or would make it less likely that companies would be drawn to come or that the country would trade, unless you have the civil and political means of actually holding governments accountable for bad policies that are going to be bad for growth and bad for citizen welfare, social and economic welfare, you're in a doom loop. So people have to be able to speak out, they have to be able to vote, they have to be able to hold a corrupt official accountable. And sometimes countries that want to, and leaders who want to retain power, change their constitutions, not hear complaints from their citizens, think that they can have the economic and social development path paved for them without the democratic accountability. And sometimes in the past, not just the United States, but Western governments generally have really pushed very hard in terms of freedom of speech and the civil and political rights without recognizing how central it is to people's lives, that they have livelihoods. And I think President Obama has really always, when he's talked about economic development, talked about the centrality of human rights to that journey, and so too talked about the hollowness for some of going and voting on an empty stomach and not being able to get medicine for your kids or to have high infant mortality rates. And so this linkage between the social and economic and the civil and political, I think is thick in people's real lives, and it should be thick in the policies that we put forward. And the private sector has a critical role because, while you come to governments and make whether a moral case or a self-interested case for human rights and pluralism and so forth, they go, yeah. When a company comes and says, look, if you don't strengthen your institutions, if I don't know if my contract is going to be enforced, if in order to get a permit to set up a business or even to put utilities in my warehouse, if I got to pay a bribe, that's not a reliable climate for me. And so much of the incentive for them to change comes from the fact that they are drawn to trying to pull in investment. And so just being vocal and articulate, even if it can sometimes feel awkward or too political, I think that's going to be a critical part of those investment climates changing and the welfare of the people over time being advanced, which is going to make for a more secure and stable world all around.
What, exactly to that point, the people here who do business around the world, and we've often thought that when we build things together, make things together, we actually form more durable and stronger ties. Is there something you'd like the business community to do more of here? And they also sometimes complain, and I'd like to get a response, that our stance on human rights, they feel sometimes hurts them in countries because the United States makes a stronger case about that than some of their foreign competitors. So how do we, what more can they do, and how do we also make that clearer?
I think I'll give you a couple examples of the sort of lead by example. So there's a kind of continuum from lead by example to more vocal engagement of the kind that I am describing and I know is hard, but that I would advocate for. If you take companies that set up and do business in, say, Saudi Arabia and who have women in prominent executive roles, just like our embassy in Saudi Arabia has women diplomats in prominent roles, that's just extremely important normatively, and it's like the city on the hill. It shows what's possible. It chips away at biases, or at least challenges them every day. Finding the right way to both lead by example and then also make clear that laws that are so discriminatory make it very hard for businesses to attract top flight employees to come and fill these jobs in societies where bias is so ingrained. I think that's a place people can go. I think on LGBT rights as well. It's again, particularly for many of those governments I mentioned, the 75 governments who have criminalized being gay, it's a kind of pragmatic argument that a CEO can make to a leader of a country and just say, look, I'm really having trouble attracting my best people because it is well known. You have these high-profile cases where you're arresting people in consensual relationships, or you've just passed some high-profile law, which has the death penalty for being gay. This is just going to make it really hard for us and make a kind of consequentialist case. My 2016 appeal, in addition to, of course, leading on human rights issues along the lines that I've described, my appeal for now relates to refugees, because there are now 60 million displaced in the world, 60 million displaced people, which include more than 20 million refugees who cross borders and then more than 40 million internally displaced. We, the United States, and we, the developed donor community, have never been more generous in the history of the world in terms of trying to address the needs of these people who have fled everything and are living in desperate conditions. And yet the gap between what is needed and what we are have been able to provide has never also been greater, because 60 million displaced is more than we've had since the Second World War, and that was a temporary displacement that when the war ended was something that we could begin to address and shrink those numbers. So what am I asking for? I think the share of citizen contributions and private contributions to tending to the flight, to providing schools, shelter, food for those who have fled into neighboring countries, countries that neighbor the country where the conflict is occurring, like Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, in the case of Syria, in Asia, with so many people fleeing Burma and persecution against Muslims there, those who flee to Malaysia, Indonesia. But just bearing in mind wherever your companies are, that there is likely to be an inflow of people who are starting over. And many in this country are either themselves descendant of refugees or know people who are, or immigrants. I mean, that's part of the richness of the fabric here. But to muster the moral imagination to say, imagine what it would be like to have been an engineer or an architect or a professor, and then find yourself stripped of literally everything, where you had to pay your life savings to the smuggler to get yourself across a border. You're there with your family. What do you do? So what does that actually entail concretely? I think material contributions to some of the organizations who are doing this essential work, again, at a time in our lifetime of unprecedented displacement. The Mercy Corps, the International Rescue Committee, the Church World Services, they're caring for people in the region, but they're also, some of these organizations care for those who actually gain admission into the United States. President Obama has committed to getting 85,000 refugees into this country this year, which is not enough, is the floor, but it's an important contribution. But also, even alongside any financial contributions that people can muster wearing their corporate social responsibility hats, the innovation and the entrepreneurship, just the skills and the insights you have that we in government and many in the humanitarian aid community just don't have, of figuring out how to harness new technologies to ensure that the educational experience is something that will allow kids. 53% of people in these camps are kids, and most of them are out of school. How could an educational experience be created that would approximate what they left behind? Is there a way to do shelter in a more cost-efficient way? Can you hire refugees? Chobani, famously in this country, 30% of its factory workforce in New York and Idaho are refugees. There are just lots of examples. Daimler in Germany has now created a vocational training program for Syrian and Iraqi refugees who come in as part of this new influx, just to give these people, again, that dignity when they arrive that is the first thing stripped of them when they're reduced to flight. So if there's anything, there's a website, aidrefugees.gov, that lists a lot of the organizations doing very important work. But if any of you are interested, the U.S. government is very eager to help do a little match.com between you and those who are out there trying to help this population in grave need.
I have one final question, because we've sort of covered the full. I was going to ask you about refugees, but we got there first. You and I sometime have talked about places where you see good governance, countries really on the move. As an example, we talked about Sri Lanka as one. Are there other places that perhaps our audience should take another look at, that they might not have looked at otherwise, that you've said, here are some places from your experience they ought to take another look at in terms of doing business, exporting, trade, and so forth?
Yeah. I would say, I'd like just to stay on Sri Lanka for a second. Sri Lanka provides a remarkable example where in such a short period of time you had first the end of a conflict, which had scared away investment. You remember had the Tamil Tigers and the government counterinsurgency effort against them. The Tamil Tigers invented effectively the suicide bomb. That conflict ended, and then a very authoritarian government, which had defeated the Tamils, began to crack down, and the investment climate, I think, was disastrous. The institutions were ravaged and weakened. And then about a year and a half ago, there was an election, and again, because there was still at least the ability to hold the government accountable at the polls, a new government is in place, and they're transforming the checks and balances. It's, you know, the rare time you open your phone or your BlackBerry and you see a news story about a president, you know, giving up power to the parliament rather than trying to extend and, you know, manipulate the Constitution in a self-serving way, to do it in the interests of institutions. So, you know, I think an example like that is extremely important, and from a policy standpoint, of course, very important to double down on. We're increasing our high-level visits and, you know, trying to enhance our security relationship. There's amazing ports, you know, in Sri Lanka. It's in a very strategic part of the world. And it has a long tradition of being a democracy, even if it was one that went through a very rocky time. So that's a very bright light, I think, on the horizon. Tunisia, of course, is the little country that can, out of the Arab Spring, institutions that had been really gutted by the dictatorship, but a place where women's rights have always been respected, and there's a strong middle-class base. Difficult now because ISIL has staged some attacks there, but that's one reason that we've deepened our security partnership with Tunisia. And it's extremely important, of course, for the experiment that they are pursuing with great bravery and resilience, for that to succeed. So that's another place I would look to. And then, of course, Burma. We've just had Aung San Suu Kyi, not quite elected president, but as she's put it, she's now going to be counselor, and I think we've already lifted many of the sanctions on Burma because of the democratization process. There's still a military check on the extent to which the democracy can go guns blazing. But I think it's a country to watch, and her stated commitments to strengthening rule of law, fighting corruption, checks and balances, I think means that it could be a place that over time, it, you know, makes for a good investment climate. It's going to take time, of course, to undo a lot of the damage that's been done over many decades. But.
Good. Okay, you've heard three. We're open.
Good news stories.
I know off the top of my head we are definitely open in Burma, and we're also open in Sri Lanka. I haven't memorized all 192 countries on our website, so we'll check on the rest. But thank you.
Thank you.
Just join me and thank you
so much.
Samantha Power for joining us.
Thank you.
That's great.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Pleasure.
much.
Of course.